Back in December, I set out to watch every single Marvel movie before Endgame came out, and it was all building up to today, where I'm going to share my picks for the 20 best Marvel movies of all time. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and this is part 3 of a series ranking all 58 Marvel movies from the worst to the best from all of the different continuities. Earlier this week, I put out part 1 with my picks for the worst Marvel movies. A couple days ago, I put out a video with my picks for the middle Marvel movies. Today, we get to the fun part where we're talking about the absolute best Marvel films. One final thing before we get started, this video is brought to you by my supporters over on Patreon. Patreon is a membership site where you can support my channel financially, and in return, you get more access to me. I like to think of it as kind of like the inner circle. There's exclusive content, weekly live streams, watch parties. You can check it out down below at the link in the description to see if it's right for you. And with that said, let's conclude this massive ranking. Bringing us into the top 20 is Blade 2. This follow-up to the original Blade simplifies the narrative and just provides a slam-bang adventure for Blade. In typical Guillermo del Toro style, the creature design here is very cool as they bring in this whole new realm of vampires and do very gory, gross, nasty stuff with the creature designs. Also in typical style of this franchise, the action is fantastic. It's very stylized, cool to look at, and nice wide angle shots so you can see what is actually happening in the fights. Also, the cast here, they added some people into the mix like Ron Perlman and Donnie Yen that just fill things out really nicely. Now, there are some special effects in the movie that do not hold up. They tried to do some full CGI characters in the fight sequences to do these cool shots. It has aged very poorly. But besides that, this might be a movie that's the least ambitious of my films in the top 20, but it delivers on the ambitions it does have. It is a nice little film. Coming in at number 19 is Black Panther. The MCU normally goes for light-hearted popcorn films, but they changed that up with Black Panther and actually decided to explore some ideas, and because of that, I find this to be one of the most mature as well as thematically rich films in the entire franchise. The way they did this was by crafting a villain who is a bad guy. He does do evil things, but there's a kernel of truth in his worldview so that when you get to the end of the film, it can be very satisfying to see him be defeated, but at the same time, he pushes and changes Wakanda. What holds this one back a little bit for me is that it is an action movie and a special effects film, and I don't find the action and special effects to be all that engaging or exciting, especially as you go into that final showdown between our hero and a villain. Some of it doesn't look very good to me, but those little minor complaints aside, I find this to be one of the most dramatically satisfying films in the entire MCU. At number 18 is Days of Future Past. Now, I know this is a movie that a lot of people go absolutely bonkers for. I'm not quite in that camp, but it is very good. It is awesome to see the two franchises bridged with a time travel story and getting to see this full cast interact with one another. You get to see Charles Xavier in a whole new way and even get to see our two of them interact back and forth. The Quicksilver sequence is fantastic. It is so entertaining with what they were able to do and how creative they were with the entire thing. And it's also really nice to see the conclusion to the relationship between Stewart and McKellen's characters. As for why it's a little bit lower on my list compared to a lot of you, there's not anything in particular that I have as a problem with this film, but for me, it's not a movie that elicits the big, gigantic emotions the way that films lower on this list do. There's a lot of films here that have some of my favorite action sequences and favorite moments in comic book movies of all time, and for me, that's just not what this movie is. Still a very good, entertaining film. Next is Blade. It's arguable that this is the movie that kicked off the modern era of comic book movies. After the genre kind of took a campier direction with movies like Batman Forever, this was a comic book movie for adults. It seems like Wesley Snipes was born to play this lead role, and the world building here I think is fantastic, and there's so many more stories I think they could have told inside of this world. This movie also introduced a distinct way that they choreographed and shot the action for all three of these movies, and I think it's held up very well. The specific story here might lack a little bit of bite, but with a movie this cool, there's no reason to complain. Number 16 is Thor Ragnarok. Now, this might be the funniest movie in the entire MCU. After a couple of lackluster Thor films, Taika Waititi came in and injected Red Bull straight into the heart of the franchise and delivered what might be the most vibrant film on this entire list. Everything about this movie is energized, from the synthy score to the bright colors to these quirky characters played by fantastic actors. Everything puts kind of a smile on your face. Beyond that, I think that there is some depth to the story that they were telling, and it really advanced the Thor story arc and set up Infinity War. With that said, the movie does kind of have some gigantic flaws in that it goes for every joke. It even cuts off the legs of dramatic sequences and undercuts the value of some key characters within the franchise just to make a joke. That's a real problem, and it holds the movie back from being top 10 material for me, but this is a very entertaining film. Coming in at number 15 is X-Men First Class. This movie for me is so much more enjoyable than I ever thought that it could be. I did not like the trailers for this film, and then I saw the film and it absolutely won me over. A huge part of that is that McAvoy and Fassbender are fantastic as younger versions of these two characters, as well as Matthew Vaughn brought this very unique and distinct 60s spy film aesthetic to the whole thing. From the production design to the way certain sequences kind of play out, it all has a distinct flavor to it. Also, Kevin Bacon is one of the forgotten great villains of this franchise. The one misstep here is that the actual First Class itself is underutilized. Beyond that, I really enjoyed this film. At number 14 is Spider-Man 2. Picking up where the first film left off, this movie continues the themes and plot lines of that film. Peter Parker's trying to balance work, family, and, well, being a superhero, and all of it is done in such a relatable fashion. Throughout the film, it builds up all of these relationships and ideas of him trying to decide if he wants to be a hero, that as you go into the latter half of the film, there's all of these huge moments of payoff, whether you're talking about the train sequence, which is absolutely fantastic, or the reveal in the third act as Mary Jane sees who he truly is. All of this is so emotionally satisfying. All of this is the payoff of everything that they've been working towards for both of these films. Where this movie is held back for me, because I know a lot of you have it in your top 5, is I've just never bought into the plot line where Peter Parker loses his powers because he's bummed out. The same way that Peter Parker falls flat on his face, this plot line falls flat on its face cinematically for me. I just don't think that type of story works in this environment. So as much as I love the finale and so many things about this film, that's a key plot line that holds it back for me. Lucky number 13 is Spider-Man Homecoming. For me, this is one of the most rewatchable films in the entire MCU. We get to see the world of superheroes and the MCU from the perspective of a high schooler, and in that you get fun high school hijinks as well as big superhero stuff at the same time. Thrown into the mix, you get to see Tony Stark, one of my favorite characters in the entire franchise, in this new mentor role that has a really nice dynamic with it. Tom Holland, I think, is just so youthfully charismatic and naive in this role that he's hard to resist. Add to the mix a great villain who's not trying to blow up the city. He's just a guy that tried to take care of his family, kind of took him in some dark and evil directions, and you get one of these movies that's just easy to watch and enjoy, and I find myself putting it on quite a bit. Then we've got X2, XMen United. This is an example of how to do a sequel right. It improves on all of the faults of the original film while giving you more of what you enjoyed about that film and taking all the good things and making them even better while providing a deeper and more engaging story. It kicks off with this excellent sequence with Nightcrawler, and it never really lets up until the end of the movie that has some moments that echo one of my favorite movies of all time, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And even though this movie has a massive cast and lots of plot lines, it never feels overcrowded or unfocused. This is a great example of how you can have an ensemble cast and a multi-layered story and still keep it action-packed and on focus. Number 11 is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. After a first film that I thought was a little bit unfocused, they tightened everything up, had a clear direction that they were headed, and and added political intrigue into the mix, and made for one of the most distinct films inside of the entire MCU. The Russos managed to make a movie that had some of the best physical, practical action inside of the franchise, as well as deepening the world building of this universe by turning the world of S.H.I.E.L.D. upside down and making some massive revelations inside of this whole franchise. This is another one where a bunch of you absolutely love this film. It's great. I'm just not quite there with you. Much like Days of Future Past, it's a film that I don't have any big, massive problems with. It just doesn't evoke as big of emotions for me as it does for some of you. Now, I love the action here. I love the world building. There's some very cool things going on, but it doesn't necessarily have those great moments for me the way that my top 10 does. Kicking off our top 10 is Deadpool. This is one of the freshest and funniest comic book movies ever made. The creators and Ryan Reynolds spent years trying to get this movie put up onto the big screen, and all of their effort and passion absolutely shows in the final product. This is also an example of one of those once-in-a-generation castings where it's difficult to imagine anyone else besides Ryan Reynolds being able to pull off this character the way that he does. But the secret sauce here is the meta humor. They found this way to comment on movies itself, the genre, and the story that they're telling in a way that is memorable, it's quotable, and it's absolutely infectious. Well, the basic story here is very straightforward. It's told in an interesting way, and it provides so much room inside of the narrative to provide boundless entertainment. Next is Guardians of the Galaxy. When they announced this film, I had no idea who the Guardians of the Galaxy were. Then they announced James Gunn and the cast, and this just seemed like a huge, gigantic risk. But the film itself is one of the most pleasant surprises I have ever had in the theater. James Gunn crafted this amazing set of quirky characters that had flaws, that find family together, that makes you actually care about each and every one of them, so much so that you actually start to tear up when a tree says, "We are Groot." Add to that, it's really funny. Almost every single character has their own distinct way in which they are hilarious. Put all the pieces together and you just get a really special film. At number 8 is Captain America Civil War. This movie encompasses so much of what I think is great about the MCU. It's a logical follow-up to Age of Ultron as well as Winter Soldier, while setting up Black Panther and so much of where the MCU goes after this film. But it also tells a single story that works in and of itself, that has dramatic tension and shows the differences between all of these characters inside of the mix. Add to that, you get some fantastic action from the Russos, of course, especially that airport sequence, but even the final duel is shot in a way that's visceral, it's exciting, and because you care about all the characters, it's emotional too. Coming in at number 7 is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. This is easily one of the most creative and unique animated films I have ever seen. They found a way to make it look like they brought a comic book to life in the visual style, in the editing style, and they even incorporated it into the way that they delivered exposition, the callback jokes throughout the entire film. All of it incorporates the material that they are adapting and creates a distinct, unique thing that we've never seen before. The multiverse plotline allows them to tell a very weird story with wacky characters that make sense in this context, but they ground it by putting Miles Morales and Peter B. Parker at the center of the story that have very real, grounded story arcs, whether you're talking about the origin story for Miles or the redemption story for Peter B. Parker. They're emotions that you can resonate with. Of all the films on this list, this might be the most comic booky of them all. Then we've got Iron Man. The movie that kickstarted the MCU remains one of its strongest character studies. Without the weight of the rest of the MCU or the expectation of going cosmic and telling a massive story, it can just focus in on Tony Stark himself and his journey. And the reason this works is because Robert Downey Jr. is absolutely fantastic in this role. Every scene is just elevated because of his charisma, his charm, his screen presence. Beyond that, Jon Favreau kind of cracked the code for how to make a Marvel movie that was fun and serious at the same time and set the template for the whole rest of the MCU and everything that was to come. If this movie didn't work, if Favreau didn't nail the tone, if Downey didn't knock it out of the park, we wouldn't have the MCU that we have today. And to that point, I wouldn't be making this video right now. Bringing us into the top 5 is Avengers Endgame. This is a movie that truly deserves to be called epic. It's probably the most emotional film inside of the entire MCU. And that's not just the individual scenes, the weight of the film in general sticks with you. To that point, it also has some of the absolute best comic book fan service of all time. There are moments in this film that, because they were the payoff of 11 years worth of buildup, I don't know that if any movie could ever top these moments inside of this film. And to that point, it's also a satisfying, earned, and worthy conclusion to the Infinity Saga and to several of our favorite characters. But as great as so much of this movie is, I do think there are some missteps that keep it out of my top 3. First off, I wasn't crazy about the big Thorbowski. Now, I don't mind the idea of that plotline at all, but the specific execution, I think, drifted a little bit too far into some SNL parody category. Likewise, I think that there's a few too many upfront contrivances and conveniences in place to set up some of those big moments. To be clear, I love this movie. I can't imagine any blockbuster this year topping this film. I'm only mentioning the negatives because I know a lot of you will be wondering why it's not in my top 3. Number 4 is Spider-Man 2002. This is the first mega hit of the modern era of comic book movies. Blade and X-Men cut the path, and then Spider-Man took full advantage of it. What I absolutely love about this film is that it's a fairly straightforward version of the classic Spider-Man tale, except because Sam Raimi has such a distinct style, it feels unique in its own way. As this was the original film, he didn't need to find a unique way to make Spider-Man interesting. He could just lean into the reason that people have always loved Spider-Man. He's such a relatable character and has a great set of characters around him. One of those being Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin, who I think is a very strong villain. He gets to chew up the scenery and just be this over-the-top character that fits the story that they were telling. Add to the mix, Danny Elfman's score is absolutely fantastic. I know a lot of you put Spider-Man 2 over this one, but for me, this origin story hits all of the right notes. Real quick before I give you my picks for the 3 best Marvel movies of all time, be sure to share your picks down below in the comment section. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, after this video, check out this playlist up above. It's got my video with my picks for the 10 best comic book movies of all time and my video with my picks for the 10 worst comic book movies of all time. If you've enjoyed this series, you gotta check it out. In 3rd place, The Avengers. Now that it's become commonplace for a team-up movie to come out every 6 months, it's easy to forget how big of a deal this film really was. Finally, they cracked the code on how to merge multiple different franchises with multiple different tones together into one movie and make it work. And they did such a good job that everyone else has been trying to copy their success with not so good results thus far. But what really makes this movie so enjoyable for me is that it's just a good old-fashioned, straightforward superhero story. It doesn't have necessarily the deepest emotions. It doesn't have the most complex plot. It's all about bringing a set of characters together to have some great banter between all of them and to take out some bad guys. The good guys just get to be good guys. The bad guys just get to be bad guys. And it makes for such a thrilling and exciting 3rd act where all of our characters get a moment in the spotlight where they get to do cool superhero stuff. So for me, this is a movie that just puts an enormous grin on my face every single time that I watch it. Our runner-up is Logan. If The Avengers was a movie that was great because it was so simple, heroic, and fun, this movie's kind of the polar opposite in that it's one of the darkest and most thematically rich films on this entire list. It's all about death, regret, redemption, fun stuff. In a lot of ways, this movie has more in common with a Western than the rest of the comic book genre. It's a small-scale story that's about the characters and the journey that they've been on, and that's why the movie works. It doesn't try to go bigger, it goes deeper. Likewise, one of the reasons this movie works is because we spent so much time with Hugh Jackman's Wolverine as well as Patrick Stewart's Charles Xavier, so we had this big background of the relationship between these two characters and the world that they have been on, so this final journey with them packs so much more of an emotional punch. It still wows me that a studio actually greenlit this film and allowed it into existence, but I'm so glad that they did. It's not necessarily the most rewatchable film, but it's one that's so rich and satisfying when I do. But coming in first place, of course, is The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan's superhero magnum opus is so powerful, it transcends the DC universe. Just kidding. Sorry, I had to have a little bit of fun. But the real number one is Avengers Infinity War. After 10 years of build-up, they delivered the first part of this conclusion to the Infinity Saga, and for me, it absolutely delivered everything that I want out of this genre. Part of that is that Thanos is such a compelling villain. They decided to make this story kind of his character arc, where we understand where he's coming from and what drove him to this insane plan. Beyond that, it brings together this amazing ensemble of characters from all these different franchises. It's so much fun to see Doctor Strange and Tony Stark bickering back and forth, Thor with the Guardians of the Galaxy, all of it absolutely just makes my mouth water thinking about it. Also, the action is absolutely fantastic, massive in scale, and filled with iconic, amazing moments. The reason this one comes out on top for me instead of Endgame, while both movies are packed with amazing moments, I left Endgame feeling like there are a couple of issues I had with the film that held it back for me. This one, I don't have any of those things. I just love this movie. This movie is the epitome of everything that I love about the MCU and the comic book genre in general. It's got amazing action, characters that I love, deep emotions, all of it. So it comes in at number one. If you've enjoyed this series, remember to check out that playlist right over there with more videos just like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.